Hello, and welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we are going to talk about the American Civil War. Now, before you imagine cannons and cavalry charges and dramatic speeches delivered on hillsides with flags waving behind them, I want to be very clear about what part of the Civil War we are going to discuss tonight. We are not going to discuss the battles. We are not going to discuss the generals, or the political decisions, or the turning points of the conflict, or any of the things that appear in bold text in history books. We are going to discuss the camps where the soldiers of both the Union and the Confederate armies spent the vast majority of their time during the war. Not fighting, not marching dramatically toward a battlefield with determined expressions, just living in tents and in wooden huts day after day, doing the ordinary things that large groups of men living in close proximity to each other do when they are not actively fighting, which was most of the time. The soldiers of the Civil War spent somewhere between 90 and 95% of their military service not in combat. They spent it in camps. They woke up in camps. They cooked in camps. They did their laundry in camps. They wrote letters home from camps. They drilled in formation in camps. They complained about the food in camps. They played cards in camps. And they went to sleep in camps. And then they woke up the next morning and did all of the same things again, because that was what camp life was. The same things repeated day after day, in the same order, in the same tents or huts, for months and sometimes for years. This is a story about those days. It is a long story. It covers the setting up of a camp and the tearing down of a camp and everything that happened in between. The reveille drum that woke the men in the morning, the coffee that was made over a small fire, the hardtack that was eaten for breakfast and dinner and sometimes supper, the drilling that occupied the morning hours, the inspections that occupied the afternoon, the letter writing that occupied the evening, and the guard duty that occupied the night for those whose turn it was. Nothing dramatic happens in this story. A soldier wakes up, he makes his coffee, he eats his hardtack, he drills, he waits, he writes a letter, he goes to sleep. And then it happens again. Make yourself comfortable. Let your breathing slow down. There is nothing here that will surprise you or alarm you or keep you from sleeping. There is only the camp and the morning drum and the long quiet days of military life between the battles, described in all their ordinary detail. Let us begin. Part 1. The setting up of a camp. When an army stopped moving and established a camp, the process was not random. It followed a sequence of steps that had been worked out over the long history of military operations and that were codified in the regulations governing the armies of both sides in the Civil War. The location was chosen by the commanding officers, who looked for specific qualities in a campsite. Access to water, which was essential for the daily needs of a large number of men. Good drainage, because a camp in a low-lying area would become a swamp after a rain. Adequate wood for fuel, because the cooking fires and the warming fires of the camp required a constant supply of wood, and a defensible position, though this concern was less pressing when the camp was well behind the lines of any likely enemy movement. Once the location was chosen and the troops were halted in the area, the process of laying out the camp began. The layout of a Civil War camp followed a prescribed pattern that reflected the military organization of the army. Each regiment had its designated area, and within that area each company was assigned its section, and within each company's section, the individual soldiers' tents or quarters were arranged in rows. The arrangement of the camp thus mirrored the organisational structure of the army, with the commanding officers' quarters at the rear and the line soldiers' quarters at the front, and the various support facilities, the kitchens and the commissary wagons and the sutler's cart, in the positions specified by the regulations. The line soldiers of a Civil War infantry regiment typically lived in one of two types of shelters, depending on the season, the length of time they expected to remain in the camp, and what materials were available. In warm weather and during active campaigning, they lived in tents. In winter, when a long stay was anticipated, they built wooden huts that provided better protection from the cold. The tent used by most Union infantry soldiers for much of the war was the shelter half, sometimes called the dog tent or the pup tent by the men who lived in it, a name that reflected their opinion of its size and adequacy. A shelter half was exactly what its name suggested, half of a tent. Each soldier carried one half, and two soldiers combined their halves to make a complete shelter, buttoning the two pieces together along the ridge and staking them to the ground with the pegs that each man carried. The resulting tent was low, roughly 5 feet wide and 5 feet long, and covered with canvas that was adequate for keeping out light rain, but less adequate for keeping out heavy rain, and that did very little to keep out the cold. The shelter half was a practical compromise between the need for shelter and the need for a soldier to carry his shelter with him on the march. It weighed a few pounds, could be rolled and strapped to the knapsack, and could be set up in a few minutes by two men who had done it many times before. It was not comfortable, and most soldiers who wrote about it described it with less than complete enthusiasm, but it was available, which was the primary quality required of shelter in an army on campaign. In winter quarters, the standard practice was to build small log huts, sometimes called shebangs in the slang of the camps, that were more substantial than the tents, and that provided real protection from cold and rain. These huts were typically built to house 4 men, the 4 bunking together in a small structure of roughly 10 feet by 12 feet, with log walls a few feet high, topped by a tent canvas roof, or, in camps where the men had sufficient time and materials, a wooden shingle or board roof. A fireplace of clay and sticks, or, in better built huts, of brick or fieldstone provided heat and a cooking surface. The men built these huts themselves, cutting the timber from the surrounding woods and constructing the walls and the fireplace and the door with the practical skills that many of them had brought from civilian life as farmers and craftsmen. The building of a winter camp could take several weeks, as each set of 4 men constructed their own hut according to their own judgment of what was most needed and most feasible given the available materials. The resulting camp was not architecturally uniform, each hut having its own character and its own particular deficiencies and qualities, but it was inhabited with the degree of pride in what the men had built for themselves, and the transition from the tent to the hut was one that most soldiers looked forward to, as the days shortened and the temperature dropped in the late autumn. Part 2. The morning. The day in a Civil War camp began with the sound of the drum. The drummer boy, who was assigned to each regiment and who was sometimes literally a boy, an adolescent who had enlisted or been enlisted as a drummer rather than as a line soldier, played the morning call at a specific hour that varied by season, and by the orders of the commanding officer, but that was always early, often before sunrise, sometimes before there was enough light to see clearly across the camp. The morning drum was called réveilleur, a word that came from the French, and that was the standard military term for the morning wake-up signal regardless of the side, since both the Union and the Confederate armies used the same basic system of drum and bugle calls that had been established in the pre-war American military. The sound of the réveillé drum was not a gentle or gradual introduction to the morning. It was a specific and recognizable pattern of beats, played at a volume sufficient to be heard throughout the camp, which meant a volume sufficient to be heard by a large number of men who were sleeping, and who would have preferred to continue sleeping. The men who lived in the camp did not generally spring to their feet at the first beat of the réveillé drum. The accounts left by soldiers of both sides in their letters and diaries suggest that the standard response to the réveillé drum was a brief pause in which consciousness returned and the morning was assessed, and the various unpleasant facts of the day were registered, followed by the gradual business of getting out the bedding, which in a tent was typically a wool blanket and in winter quarters was a blanket or sometimes two, and putting on the clothes that had been removed the night before. The issue of what soldiers wore to sleep in their tents was not a complicated one. They wore, in most cases, whatever they had been wearing during the day, minus perhaps the boots and the jacket, since sleeping fully clothed was warm, and also meant that less time was required in the morning to be dressed and ready. The boots were pulled back on, the jacket was buttoned, the kepi or forage cap was placed on the head, and the man was, in the practical military sense, ready for the day, which began with roll call. Roll call, the first roll call of the day, was conducted within a short time of the réveillé drum, each company assembling in its designated area, and the sergeant calling out the names of every man in the company, and marking the presence or absence of each one in the company book. This process was repeated at various points throughout the day, the multiple roll calls being a mechanism for ensuring that all men were present and accounted for, and that any absences, whether from desertion, illness, or other cause, were identified and reported. The morning roll call was one of the least popular features of camp life, combining the unpleasantness of being out of one's blankets before sunrise with the indignity of being counted like an item in a warehouse inventory. But it was regular and unavoidable, and the men attended it with the resigned compliance of people who have learned that some things are done. After roll call, the first task of the morning was the making of coffee. Part 3. The coffee. Coffee was the most important daily substance in a Civil War soldier's life, more important than the various foods that were provided by the commissary, more anticipated than any other element of the daily routine, more consistently mentioned in the letters and diaries of the men than anything except possibly the mail from home. This is not an exaggeration. The documentary record of the Civil War camps is saturated with references to coffee, to its making and its quality and its availability and its absence when the supply lines were disrupted and it could not be obtained. The coffee issued to Union soldiers was issued as whole roasted beans that the men ground themselves, which they did by wrapping a quantity of beans in a cloth and crushing them with the butt of a musket or a flat rock, or any other hard object that could be used as an improvised grinding tool. The grinding was not fine or consistent, producing a mixture of coarsely broken beans and dust, and some whole beans that had not been cracked, and the resulting brew had a character that reflected this imprecision, being strong in the sections of the liquid that had been in contact with the finest grounds and weaker elsewhere. Confederate soldiers had a more complicated relationship with coffee throughout the war, as the blockade of southern ports reduced the supply of coffee from the early years of the conflict, and left many Confederate soldiers without it for extended periods, a deprivation that they documented with considerable feeling. The method of brewing coffee in the Civil War camp was simple, because the equipment available was simple. The standard method was to put water in a tin cup or a small pot, bring it to a boil over the fire, add the ground or crushed coffee, allow it to boil for a brief period, and then allow the grounds to settle before drinking. The result was what would now be called cowboy coffee or boiled coffee, strong and somewhat gritty from the grounds that did not fully settle, and dark to the point of being opaque. It was consumed with whatever additions were available, which in the camp was sometimes sugar and sometimes nothing, the sugar supply being as variable as any other supply. The fire over which the coffee was made was a small fire, built by the individual soldier or by the group of messmates who cooked and ate together, using whatever wood was available in the vicinity of the camp. The gathering of wood was one of the daily tasks of camp life, and in camps that had been occupied for some weeks, the wood near the camp had generally been consumed, and the men were walking increasing distances to find fuel. Some camps addressed this by organizing wood-cutting details, groups of men sent out under supervision to cut wood from the surrounding forest and bring it back for distribution. But in practice, the individual soldier's small fire was usually built from whatever he had gathered himself from the nearest available source. The small fire, the tin cup, the boiling water, the crushed coffee, and the brief wait for the grounds to settle. This was the morning routine of the Civil War soldier that preceded all other activities of the day, and that was so universal and so consistently described across both armies and all years of the conflict that it constitutes a genuine defining characteristic of the experience. The first cup of coffee of the morning was the threshold between the night and the day, between the state of sleeping and the state of being awake and functional, and its importance in that transition was recognized by everyone who experienced it. Part 4. The Hardtack. After the coffee came the hardtack, and after the hardtack came more hardtack, and after that, if there was nothing else, there was hardtack again, because hardtack was the foundational food of the Civil War soldier, the thing that was always there when other things were not. The food that was mentioned in more letters and diary entries and memoir accounts than any other single item, always with the same mixture of factual description and resigned complaint. Hardtack was a cracker, or a biscuit, or something that occupied the same conceptual space as a cracker or a biscuit, without having any of the qualities that make crackers and biscuits pleasant. It was made from flour and water and salt, mixed into a stiff dough, rolled flat, cut into squares of approximately 3 by 3 inches, and baked until it was completely dry and very hard. The hardness was intentional, not a deficiency. A cracker that was soft would absorb moisture during storage and transport and become mouldy, while a cracker baked to complete dryness would remain edible, if not appetizing, for months or years if kept dry. The issue with hardtack, as documented extensively in the personal writings of the soldiers who ate it, was not primarily its hardness, though the hardness was a genuine practical problem for men whose teeth were not in perfect condition. The issue was more fundamental. It was nearly always the food available, and it was nearly always the same. Meal after meal, day after day, in camp and on the march, and in positions where nothing else could be brought up. A soldier who had been eating hardtack for 3 months had eaten hardtack for 3 months. It was not varied by the passage of time. It was the same hardtack from the same barrels, baked to the same recipe, tasting of nothing except flour and salt, and sometimes the weevils that infested it after extended storage. The weevils were a noted feature of hardtack that had been in storage for some time. The small beetles that colonized hardtack were present in the cracker in their larval form as well as their adult form, the larvae being embedded in the cracker material and not immediately visible on the surface. Soldiers who wrote about this phenomenon did so with varying degrees of disturbance, some clearly finding it deeply unpleasant, and others having arrived at a philosophical acceptance that the protein content of the weevils was not entirely unwelcome in a diet otherwise short of it. The standard method for dealing with weevil-infested hardtack was to break the cracker into a cup of hot coffee and allow the weevils, disturbed by the heat and the immersion, to float to the surface where they could be skimmed off before consuming the resulting mixture. This method of softening hardtack in coffee, or in water, was also the standard method for making hardtack more edible in general. The hard cracker softening to something that could be eaten without the risk of dental injury, and absorbing the flavour of whatever liquid it was immersed in, which improved it marginally. Other methods included frying the cracker in pork fat, which produced a greasy but somewhat more palatable result, or crushing it into a powder and combining it with water to make a kind of paste that was then cooked over the fire into something resembling a dense cake, which the soldiers called hardtack pudding or similar names in the various regional slangs of the armies. The ration issued to soldiers of both armies also included salt pork or salt beef, dried or fresh vegetables depending on availability, and sometimes dried beans or peas. The salt pork was a significant component of the diet when available, providing fat and protein in a preserved form that could be transported and stored without refrigeration. It was eaten fried, boiled or raw depending on the circumstances, the last option being practiced primarily when no fire was available or when the time required to cook it was not available, which was a condition that applied primarily on the march rather than in the camp. The cooking of the rations was done in the mess, which was the small group of 4 to 8 men who had organized themselves with the purposes of cooking and eating together. The mess was a social and practical institution, the unit of daily life below the company, and the quality of the cooking in any given mess depended largely on the interest and skill of whoever happened to be doing the cooking on any given day, which rotated among the members. Some messes produced food that was better than the basic rations required by applying whatever additional knowledge and materials the men had, and some messes produced food that was exactly what the basic rations would produce, with the minimum of effort. And the difference between these two outcomes was one of the variables of camp life that the individual soldier had some control over. Part 5. The Drill. After breakfast, which is to say after the coffee and the hardtack, the morning hours of camp life were typically given over to drill. The drill of a Civil War infantry regiment was a formal exercise in which the men practiced the movements required for battlefield maneuvering, the various formations and the commands that produced them, the loading and presenting of arms, the marching in step and in line and in column, the wheeling of the line to change direction, and the numerous other specific movements that an infantry regiment needed to perform reliably in order to function effectively on the battlefield. The manual of arms, which was the set of prescribed movements for handling the musket or rifle in response to verbal commands, occupied a significant portion of the drill time. The commands included attention, order arms, shoulder arms, present arms, fix bayonets, charge bayonets, and a number of others, each corresponding to a specific position of the weapon and the soldier's body. These were practiced individually, each command given and the corresponding movement performed until it became automatic, and then practiced in sequence, the drill sergeant calling the commands in the standard order while the men performed the movements. The drill sergeant, or the company officer who conducted the drill, stood before the company and called the commands in a voice that carried to all the men in the formation, which required some projection, but not shouting in the way that actual battlefield commands sometimes required. The men stood in their ranks and performed the movements in unison, or as close to unison as could be achieved by a group of men who had varying levels of experience and varying degrees of physical coordination and varying degrees of enthusiasm for the exercise. The enthusiasm for drill among Civil War soldiers was, according to the documentary record, variable. Men who had recently enlisted and who were eager to prove their military competence were sometimes genuinely interested in the drill and applied themselves to it with energy. Men who had been drilling for months and who could perform every movement in the manual of arms in their sleep were less interested, having long since concluded that the repetition was not producing any further improvement in their already adequate performance, and was therefore primarily an exercise in patience. The drill was conducted regardless of the enthusiasm of the participants, because it served purposes that went beyond the immediate attitude of the men being drilled. It maintained the physical conditioning of the soldiers. It preserved the habits of precision and obedience that military operations required, and it occupied the morning hours in a structured way that prevented the idleness that officers considered a precursor to indiscipline. The bayonet drill was a separate exercise from the basic manual of arms, conducted on some days in place of, or in addition to, the regular drill. The bayonet drill involved the practice of the movements of bayonet fighting, the advance, the thrust, the parry, the withdrawal. These movements were practiced against straw. Dummies are against each other with the bayonets removed from the rifles, the partners going through the attack and defense sequences in slow motion and then at normal speed. The bayonet drill was physically more demanding than the standing drill of the manual of arms and required more space, which was accommodated by conducting it in an open area outside the main camp, where the men had room to move without interfering with each other. The marching drill, in which the company or the regiment practiced the various formations of movement, was conducted on a clear area of ground near the camp that served as the parade ground. The parade ground was an important feature of the camp, being the space where not only drill but also formal inspections and reviews and the various other ceremonies of military life were conducted. In a camp that had been established for some weeks, the parade ground was a well-defined area of packed earth, the grass long since worn away by the repeated marching of the men across it, bordered by the company streets on each side. The marching drill began with the company formed in line, the men standing in two ranks with their files dressed to the right, so that the line was as straight as could be achieved. The command of forward march set the company in motion, each man stepping off with the left foot simultaneously, in theory, the simultaneous step producing the measured regular sound of a line of men marching in step that was one of the characteristic sounds of the drill ground. The command halt stopped the motion, each man bringing both feet together on the last step and coming to the position of attention. The command right face turned the entire company 90 degrees to the right, each man pivoting on his left heel. The command company wheel right caused the right end of the line to remain approximately in place while the left end swept around in an arc, the whole line rotating like a gate around a fixed post. These movements, practiced over and over in the morning drill sessions, were the building blocks of the tactical formations that infantry used in battle, and the fluency with which a regiment could execute them determined in part how effectively it could maneuver on a battlefield. The drilling was therefore genuinely useful military training, not merely ceremonial, and the officers who conducted it and the men who underwent it were both aware of this, though the awareness did not make the repetition less repetitive. Part 6. The mail. The mail was the most anticipated event of the camp day, more anticipated than the food, and more anticipated than any scheduled activity, because the mail from home was the connection between the soldier in the camp and the life he had left behind, and the maintenance of that connection was something that soldiers of both sides devoted considerable effort to throughout the war. The mail reached the camp through a system that was imperfect by the standards of the present day, but that functioned with reasonable regularity when the army was in a stable position, and the supply and communication lines were not disrupted by military operations. Letters from home addressed to a soldier at his regiment would make their way through the postal system to the regiment, where they were sorted by company and distributed by the orderly sergeant. The distribution of mail was a moment of significant emotional weight in the daily life of the camp, the men gathering around the sergeant and waiting to hear their names called, and the contrast between those who received a letter and those who did not was a daily reminder of the connection between the individual soldier and the wider world from which he had been temporarily extracted. The letters that soldiers received from home were generally not eventful letters in the way that novels use the word eventful. They were accounts of ordinary domestic life, who had planted what in the garden, how the crops were coming along, what the neighbours had been doing, whether the cow was still giving enough milk, whether the children were well, what the weather had been, what the prices at the market were, whether any other young men from the neighbourhood had enlisted. These were the facts of the lives the soldiers had left, communicated in the careful handwriting of people who were not practiced letter writers and who struggled sometimes to fill the pages with sufficient words to justify the postage. The soldiers replied with their own letters, which were similarly ordinary in their content, but which document in their totality the daily experience of camp life with a completeness and a specificity that more formal historical sources do not provide. A soldier writing home from camp in the winter of 1862 or 1863 might describe the construction of his hut, the quality of the current rations, the names and characters of his messmates, the condition of his equipment, the nature of the most recent drill, what he could see from his position in the camp, what the weather was like, and what he hoped would be in the next box from home. These details, accumulated across millions of letters, constitute the primary documentary evidence of what camp life was actually like, and they are the main source for the account given in this story. The writing of letters was done in the evenings after the day's duties were complete, by candlelight or firelight, with whatever writing materials were available. Paper and envelopes were supplied by the army in limited quantities and were supplemented by the soldiers' own purchases from the sutler, who was the civilian merchant licensed to sell goods to the troops in the camp. A soldier with no paper might write on whatever was available, including the blank backs of printed notices or the margins of newspapers that had reached the camp. The pen or pencil, which was more commonly used in camp conditions, was a basic item that most soldiers maintained as part of their personal kit. Part 7. The Sutler. The sutler was a fixture of Civil War camp life. A civilian merchant who had obtained a license from the military authorities to set up a store at the camp and sell goods to the soldiers. The sutler's tent or hut was typically situated at the edge of the camp, and the goods available there supplemented the standard military rations and equipment with a range of items that the army did not supply, but that soldiers wanted. Canned goods, dried fruit, cheese, butter, cookies, writing paper and envelopes, thread and needles, combs, additional clothing items, pipes and tobacco, and various other things. The prices at the sutler's tent were consistently described in soldiers' letters and diaries as high, the sutler having a captive market and no competition within the camp. A tin of condensed milk that would have cost a few cents in a civilian store might cost several times that from the sutler, and the men who depended on him for supplements to their rations paid these prices because there was no alternative. The sutler was consequently an unpopular figure in the camp, necessary but resented, his prices a subject of ongoing complaint that appears with great regularity in the personal writings of the men. The government issued a monthly pay to soldiers, which for a private in the Union Army was $13 per month, and for a private in the Confederate Army was $11. Though Confederate soldiers frequently went long periods without receiving their pay at all, as the Confederate financial situation deteriorated through the course of the war. The $13 or $11 when it arrived was the soldier's entire income, and it was expected to cover the costs of the sutler's supplements and any other personal expenses, the sending of money home when possible, and whatever small pleasures were available in camp life. The system by which the sutler was paid was often the system of the paybook, in which the soldier's purchases were recorded in a book maintained by the sutler and deducted from the soldier's pay when it was issued, the sutler having priority over the soldier's own access to his pay for the debts accumulated in the previous period. This system was convenient for the soldier in the short term, allowing him to obtain goods without cash, and inconvenient in the longer term when the accumulated debts consumed most or all of the pay when it arrived. The goods most consistently purchased at the sutler's, according to the record of purchases and the references in letters, were those that supplemented the most deficient aspects of the standard ration. Vegetables were almost always deficient in the army ration, and canned vegetables and dried fruit from the sutler were purchased when the soldiers could afford them, the men being aware that the lack of fresh vegetables was causing problems, including the development of scurvy in camps where the deficiency was severe enough. Butter and cheese were purchased when available because the standard ration included neither. Tobacco was purchased in large quantities by those who smoked, which was most of the men in the camp. Part 8. The guard duty was one of the rotating obligations of camp life, coming around to each soldier with the regularity of any duty assigned by rotation through the company, and it was one of the less popular of those duties, combining the requirement of being awake and alert during the night with the requirement of standing or walking, a fixed post in whatever weather the night produced. The guard detail for a camp was organised by the officer of the day, who was the commissioned officer responsible for the security and discipline of the camp for a 24-hour period on a rotating basis. The officer of the day assigned the guards to their posts, inspected them at intervals during their duty period, and was responsible for any security incidents that occurred during his watch. The guard posts were positioned around the perimeter of the camp, and at any internal points requiring supervision, such as the commissary stores. Each guard served a 2-hour watch, followed by 4 hours off, in a rotation that continued through the 24-hour guard detail. The 2 hours of actual guard duty were spent walking or standing at the assigned post, which was a specific stretch of the camp perimeter that the guard was responsible for. The walking of the post was not merely for physical warmth, though in cold weather it served that purpose too. It was the means by which the guard maintained surveillance of the area and demonstrated to anyone who might approach that the post was occupied and attended to. The guard challenge was the verbal exchange by which the guard identified anyone approaching his post in the darkness. The challenge was issued in a specific form. The guard called halt and then demanded identification, the person approaching providing a countersign, which was the password established for the day and known only to authorized personnel. This procedure was followed regardless of whether the approaching figure was obviously a fellow soldier returning to camp or an officer making a round of the guard posts, the adherence to the procedure being itself a demonstration that the guard was performing his duty correctly. The night guard duty in the winter months was particularly uncomfortable. Standing or walking a fixed post in the cold, often in the dark, for 2 hours was physically unpleasant in a way that was not dramatic or unusual, but simply unpleasant. And the men who wrote about it described it in the patient tones of people describing something that is simply the way things are. The cold was cold. The watch was 2 hours. When the relief came, the guard could return to his blankets and sleep until his next watch, and the next watch would come in 4 hours, and this would repeat through the night until the morning drum. The relief of the guard was performed by the corporal of the guard, who was the non-commissioned officer responsible for managing the rotation of the guard detail, moving from post to post through the night and relieving each guard in turn. The corporal of the guard walked a considerable distance through the night in the course of his duties, covering the full circuit of the camp's guard posts each time the rotation occurred, and his night was consequently less restful than that of the individual guards, who at least had their 4-hour intervals of sleep. Part 9. The Inspection. The inspection was a regular feature of camp life, occurring at various intervals depending on the orders of the commanding officers and the current focus of military activity. A full inspection of the regiment was a formal occasion in which the men stood in formation with their equipment and their weapons and their persons presented for review, and the inspecting officer walked the ranks examining each man's rifle, his ammunition, his clothing, his equipment, and his general state of cleanliness and military bearing. The preparation for an inspection occupied a significant portion of the day that preceded it, the men spending the hours cleaning and arranging their equipment and their persons to the standard required. The rifle was the most important item for inspection purposes, and the preparation of the rifle for inspection involved cleaning the barrel with the cleaning rod and a patch of cloth that removed the carbon deposits from the bore, polishing the metal fittings and the lock mechanism, and oiling the moving parts to ensure smooth operation. A rifle that was inspected and found to be dirty or poorly maintained resulted in a reprimand for the soldier, and sometimes additional duty as a consequence. The uniform was similarly prepared, the wool coat brushed to remove dust and any accumulated debris, the brass buttons cleaned to a brightness with a cloth, or with the commercially available button polish that some soldiers maintained in their kit for this purpose. The leather of the cartridge box and the belt was cleaned and darkened with the blacking material that was supposed to be applied to leather equipment to maintain its appearance. The knapsack was packed and strapped according to the regulations specifying exactly how it was to be arranged, the various items in their prescribed places. The inspection itself, when it came, was a formal proceeding that was conducted with the specific language and sequence prescribed by military regulations. The inspecting officer, followed by the company commander and the first sergeant, moved down the front rank, stopping at each man and examining his rifle, his cartridge box and its contents, his person and his general bearing. The soldier stood at attention while being inspected, looking straight ahead, the rifle held in the prescribed position for inspection, not moving or speaking unless addressed by the inspecting officer. The officer might ask to see the soldier's ammunition, in which case the soldier opened his cartridge box and displayed the contents. He might examine the barrel of the rifle by holding it up to the light. He might run his finger along a piece of equipment to check for dust or grime. These examinations were conducted quietly and efficiently, the officer moving at a pace that covered the inspection of a full company in a reasonable time without rushing. The sergeant who followed made notes of any deficiencies observed, which were reported to the company commander and addressed in the period following the inspection. Part 10. The Hospital. The hospital in the Civil War camp occupied a section of the camp that was separate from the men's quarters, and that was identified as the medical facility of the regiment. In the early period of the war, the medical facilities were often inadequate, the Army's medical corps having been organised on a scale appropriate to the peacetime army, and not the enormous forces that the war produced, and the hospitals of that early period were sometimes simply large tents or borrowed buildings that provided little more than a roof over the sick men. As the war continued, the organisation of the medical corps improved, and the regimental hospitals became more effectively managed and better supplied, though they remained limited in what they could provide by the standards of later medical care. The medicines available to the surgeons included quinine, which was used for malaria, morphine and opium, which were used for pain, chloroform, which was used as an anesthetic during surgical procedures, and various other preparations of the period's pharmacopoeia, some of which were effective and some of which were not. The most common reason for a soldier to appear in the regimental hospital was not a wound received in battle, because the camp was not a battlefield, and combat was not the constant condition. The most common reason was illness, and the illnesses that afflicted Civil War soldiers in their camps were the infectious diseases that inevitably appeared when large numbers of men were living in close proximity, often without adequate sanitation and without prior immunity to the diseases circulating in the group. Diarrhea and dysentery were the most prevalent conditions in Civil War camps throughout the war, the disruption of the digestive system being a consequence of the combination of contaminated water, inadequate cooking of food, and the presence of bacteria to which the soldiers had not been previously exposed. The soldiers of both armies used the word the runs, or the quick step, or various other colloquial names for this condition in their letters home, the frequency of these references reflecting the frequency of the condition itself. Typhoid fever, which spread through contaminated water and food, was a serious illness that killed a significant number of soldiers in both armies during the camp periods of the war. Pneumonia and other respiratory illnesses were common in the winter months, particularly in the earlier period of the war when adequate shelter and clothing were not always available. Malaria was endemic in certain regions, particularly in the southern parts of the theatre, and in areas with standing water where the mosquitoes that transmitted the disease were present. The surgeon of the regiment held a daily sick call, at which soldiers who were unwell presented themselves for examination and treatment. The sick call was conducted in the morning after roll call, the sick men forming a line outside the surgeon's tent and being seen in turn. The surgeon examined each man briefly and made a disposition. Some were excused from duty for the day and sent back to their tent. Some were admitted to the hospital for treatment, and some were told that their condition did not warrant excuse from duty and were returned to the ranks. Part 11. The Religion. The religious life of the Civil War camp was organised around the chaplain, an officer position that was filled in most regiments by a minister or priest who had volunteered for or been appointed to the role. The chaplain was responsible for conducting religious services, visiting the sick in the hospital, writing letters for men who could not write, counselling those who sought it, and generally attending to the spiritual and moral welfare of the regiment. The effectiveness with which chaplains performed these various roles varied considerably, some being dedicated and well regarded by the men, and others being less effective and less present. Religious services in the camp were conducted on Sundays when the military situation permitted, which was a condition that excluded the services during active campaigns, but that was met in the more settled conditions of winter quarters and stable camp positions. The Sunday service was a simple ceremony by the standards of the established churches of the period. A hymn, a reading from scripture, a sermon, a prayer. The men who attended came from a variety of Protestant denominations and from the Catholic Church, and the chaplain's service was typically non-denominational enough to include most of them, which required a degree of theological flexibility that not all chaplains possessed equally. Attendance at the Sunday service was voluntary, which meant that it was attended by those who chose to attend and not attended by those who did not, and the accounts suggest that attendance varied considerably depending on the popularity of the chaplain, the nature of the religious sensibility of the regiment's population, and the alternatives available for the time. A well-regarded chaplain who preached accessible and brief sermons drew larger congregations than a less regarded one who preached long and theologically dense ones, which was a pattern that repeated in civilian church life as well. Prayer meetings and Bible study groups were organized by the chaplain, and sometimes by the men themselves in the evenings, and these smaller gatherings were reported in some regiments to be more popular than the formal Sunday service, their informal character being more suited to the conditions of camp life. The religious revival movements that swept through certain sections of the Confederate Army, in particular during the later years of the war, produced periods of intense religious activity in the camps affected, with meetings held nightly and large numbers of men reported to have converted or recommitted to their faith. The distribution of Bibles and religious tracts was a priority of the various religious organizations that supplied the armies from the civilian population. The American Bible Society and the American Tract Society and their Confederate counterparts produced large quantities of small format Bibles and pocket-sized New Testaments specifically for distribution to soldiers, and these were distributed through the chaplains and through the mail from home. A soldier who carried a Bible did so not necessarily from fervent piety, but sometimes from the more practical consideration that a Bible was small enough to fit in a pocket, and that letters from home and certain kinds of literature were not always available. Part 12. The leisure hours, the hours of the camp day that were not occupied by the prescribed duties of military life, were occupied by whatever the soldiers chose to do with them, and the record of what they chose to do provides a picture of the leisure culture of the Civil War camp that is as specific and as revealing as the record of their work. Card playing was among the most universal leisure activities of the camp. The standard card games of the period, including poker and euchre and whist, were played by groups of soldiers in their tents and huts whenever cards and players and time were simultaneously available, which was frequently. Cards were a compact entertainment requiring no fixed equipment except a deck, which was a portable item that many soldiers maintained as part of their personal kit. The gambling that accompanied card playing was a subject of some official concern, as the army regulations of both sides technically prohibited gambling, a prohibition that was enforced with varying degrees of consistency, and that was widely ignored. Baseball was played in the Civil War camps, and this is one of the facts about the conflict that most clearly illustrates the distance between the military history of the war and the daily life of the camps. Baseball in the 1860s was a relatively new sport that was in the process of standardizing its rules and spreading from its origins in the urban Northeast to the broader American population. And the Civil War camps, by bringing together men from every state and region, were one of the mechanisms by which the sport was disseminated. Soldiers who had learned the game in cities in the Northeast taught it to men from rural areas of the Midwest and South who had not encountered it, and games were organized on the open ground near the camps with the equipment available, which sometimes included proper bats and balls and sometimes did not. Checkers and chess were played by those who had or could obtain boards and pieces, and boards were made by the men themselves from any flat surface that could be marked with the required squares. Dominoes were another game played in the camps. The making and playing of games was one of the ways that soldiers who had been trained in a craft applied their skills to the conditions of camp life. A carpenter making a chess set from pieces of wood being an activity that combined the practical application of skill with the production of something that could be used for entertainment over an extended period. Music was an important part of camp life, both the organised music of the regimental bands and the informal music of individuals and small groups in their quarters. The regimental band, present in most regiments at the beginning of the war, provided formal music for marches and reviews, and sometimes gave informal concerts in the evening for the camp's entertainment. Individual soldiers who played instruments brought them from home or obtained them through the mail, and the sounds of fiddles and banjos and mouth harps were common evening sounds in both Union and Confederate camps. The singing of songs, both the popular songs of the period and the hymns that were part of the religious life of the camp, was widespread enough to be commented on by observers as a characteristic feature of the Civil War camp. Reading was pursued by those who could read and who had access to reading material, which meant newspapers when they could be obtained, and books and periodicals when they were available. Newspapers were brought to the camps by the news vendors who followed the armies on campaign, selling papers to soldiers at prices that reflected the scarcity of the material and the captivity of the market, and newspapers that reached the camp circulated through many hands before being used as kindling. The Harper's Weekly illustrated news magazine was particularly popular in Union camps, its combination of news reporting and visual illustration making it accessible to men with varying levels of literacy. Letter writing was both a duty and a leisure activity. The soldier who sat down to write a letter to his mother or his wife, being simultaneously maintaining the emotional connections that sustained him and spending his time in a way that was personally satisfying. The letter writing of Civil War soldiers was of consistently high quality relative to the formal education of the men, many of whom had received only basic schooling, but who wrote with a clarity and an expressiveness that reflected the seriousness with which they approached the task. A letter to a loved one from a camp 500 miles from home was not written carelessly. Part 13. The Seasons. The character of camp life changed with the seasons in ways that were fundamental rather than superficial, the summer camp and the winter camp being different enough in their daily conditions to constitute almost different experiences. The summer camp was the camp of heat and insects and dust. The heat of a southern summer in a canvas tent was considerable, the canvas conducting and holding the heat of the sun so that the interior of the tent during the afternoon hours was significantly hotter than the air outside it. The men who lived in summer camps adapted to this by spending as little time as possible inside the tent during the heat of the day, seeking whatever shade was available from trees or from the structures of the camp, and conducting the activities that could be done outdoors in the morning and evening hours when the temperature was lower. The insects of the summer camp were a constant presence. Mosquitoes were the most significant in terms of health consequences, as the malaria they transmitted was a serious and sometimes fatal illness. But they were also simply unpleasant in the way that mosquitoes are always unpleasant when present in large numbers at night, making sleep difficult and requiring the use of whatever protections were available, which in the Civil War camp was primarily the wool blanket pulled over the face and any exposed skin. Flies were present in enormous numbers in any camp that contained horses and mules and a large population of men. The combination of animal waste and human waste and food residue providing an environment highly suitable for flies. The dust of the summer camp in those regions where the soil dried out enough to produce dust was part of the experience of all the activities conducted on the bare earth of the camp. The morning drill, the walking of the company streets, the carrying of water from the nearest source, the simple movement from one part of the camp to another. The dust rose from the feet of anyone walking on the camp's exposed ground and settled on everything: the food, the equipment, the clothing, the men themselves. The winter camp was different in almost every respect. The insects were gone. The dust was replaced by mud, which in its own way was equally inconvenient. The mud of a winter camp being the mud of many men moving through wet earth and churning it to a consistency that clung to boots and equipment and the floors of the huts. The cold was the constant background condition of the winter camp, against which all other conditions were measured. The adequacy of the shelter, the sufficiency of the fuel, the warmth of the blanket, the temperature of the coffee. The winter was also the time of winter quarters, the semi-permanent camps that the armies established when the season made active campaigning impractical, and winter quarters were the most settled and in some ways the most human of the camp situations. The men who built their huts and established their messes and organised their leisure activities in winter quarters were doing something that partook of ordinary domestic life in a way that the mobile summer camp did not, creating a small community with its own social structures and its own routines and its own particular character. Part 14. The March Out. At some point, the camp that had been the soldiers' home for weeks or months was struck, and the army moved. The order to march came through the chain of command, reaching the regiment in the form of orders issued by the regimental commander, and the camp that had been a settled community was dismantled over the course of a morning or an afternoon. The tents struck and rolled, the equipment packed, the fires extinguished, and the men formed up in column for the march. The striking of a tent camp was accomplished more quickly than the striking of winter quarters, since a tent required only that its stakes be pulled, its ropes loosened, and its canvas folded and packed, while a wooden hut had to be left behind, abandoned to whoever came after, which was sometimes nothing, and sometimes a subsequent unit that occupied the same campsite and found the hut still standing and usable. The moment of leaving a long-occupied camp was described in some soldiers' letters as producing a sentiment that was difficult to name precisely. Not exactly regret, since the camp had never been comfortable in any way that would warrant regret at leaving it, but something like the feeling of leaving a place that had become familiar, which is its own kind of attachment regardless of the qualities of the place. The hut that had been built with some effort and occupied through a winter was not a home in the full sense, but was the closest thing to a home that the man had had for several months, and the leaving of it was the leaving of that, which was a small thing, but was real. The column formed and began to move, and the camp that had been the regiment's world shrank behind them as the distance increased, and became a collection of abandoned structures in an open field, and then disappeared behind the curve of the road or the crest of a hill, and the march was simply the march again, one foot in front of the other, with the equipment on the back and the rifle on the shoulder, going wherever the army was going, for whatever reason the army was going there, at the pace of 20 or so miles a day if the road was good and the weather was fair. And somewhere ahead the army would stop again, and the tents would come out of the rolls, or the axes would come out, and the trees near the road would begin to be cut, and the camp would begin to be built again in a new place, with the same materials, in the same order, starting with the selection of the campsite and ending with the placement of the last tent peg, or the daubing of the last gap in the last hut wall with the clay that was always available somewhere near any campsite. And then the drum would sound in the morning, before sunrise as it always sounded, and the roll call would be held, and the coffee would be made, and the hardtack would be eaten, and the drill would be conducted, and the mail would arrive or not arrive, and the guard duty would come around again, and the day would pass as the days in the camp always passed, one after another in the same order until the army moved again. This was the life of the Civil War soldier in his camp. It was not the life of the novels or the films or the stirring accounts of the battles. It was this. The coffee and the hardtack and the drill and the roll call and the mail and the guard duty and the smell of the tent and the sound of the morning drum and the long evenings by the fire and the letter that was being written and the letter that had arrived and the card game in the next tent and the song someone was playing on a fiddle somewhere in the company street. It was the ordinary life of men living together in difficult conditions and making of those conditions whatever they could be made into, which was not very much but was sufficient day after day for the duration, which was what was required and which was what they gave. Part 15. The Evening. The evening in the Civil War camp began when the official duties of the day ended, which was typically in the late afternoon after the last scheduled drill or fatigue detail of the day, and it extended until the drum sounded tattoo, the evening drum call that was the signal for lights out in the tents. The interval between the end of duties and tattoo was the freest time of the soldier's day, the time in which he could do with his hours roughly what he chose. The supper, such as it was cooked and eaten in the early evening. The mess group gathered around their small fire, and whatever they had assembled for the meal was cooked and served and eaten, the process taking perhaps half an hour from the starting of the fire to the cleaning of the tin plates, and then the evening was available for whatever followed. In the summer, the evenings were pleasant in a way that the summer days were not, the heat of the day having moderated and the light lasting long enough to do things by. Men sat outside their tents in the long summer evenings and talked and played cards and wrote letters and watched the activity of the camp around them. In the winter, the evening was spent indoors, or rather inside the hut, gathered around the small fireplace that was the hut's central feature, the warmth of the fire marking a circle of comfort within which the men sat and did the various things they did in the evenings. The tattoo drum, when it came, was the signal that the official day was ending and that the men were expected to be in their quarters. It was not a rigid enforcement of silence, and the actual behaviour in the tents after tattoo included talking and card playing and various other activities that were not technically consistent with the lights out principle. But it was a real signal and a real boundary, and after it the character of the camp changed, the public spaces becoming quieter, and the activity retreating into the private spaces of the individual tents and huts. The last roll call of the day, called tattoo roll call in some accounts, was held at the tattoo drum, the company forming one last time, and the sergeant calling the names and marking the book. After this, the men were officially in for the night. The fire in the hut was reduced, or left at whatever level the men chose, and the blankets were arranged, and the day concluded in the way it had always concluded, with sleep coming sooner or later depending on the individual and on what the day had been, in the tent or the hut that was the soldier's home for as long as the army stayed in this place. The drum would sound again in the morning. It always sounded again in the morning. The coffee would be made, the hardtack would be eaten, the drill would be conducted, the mail would be distributed or not distributed, the guard duty would come around when it came around, the letter would be written, or started and not finished, or not started at all depending on the day, and in the evening the fire would be small, and the tent or the hut would be warm enough or not quite warm enough, and the sound of talking or of a fiddle from somewhere in the camp would be in the background, and the man writing the letter would be writing about what he was eating and what the weather was like and how long he thought it might be before he could come home, and he would blow out his candle, and the camp would be quiet, and the morning would come as it always did before the light, and the drum would sound. End. A boring history for sleep. Life in camps during the Civil War. The drum sounded before sunrise, as it always did. The men rolled out of their blankets and pulled on their boots without checking them for scorpions, because this was not the prairie, but a canvas tent in Virginia, or Tennessee, or Maryland, and the boots were simply boots, sitting where they had been left the night before, cold in the morning air. The coffee was made in a tin cup over a small fire, the crushed beans boiled in the water until the ground settled, or mostly settled, and the coffee was drunk standing by the fire because standing by the fire was warmer than standing away from it. The hardtack was eaten, broken into the coffee if the morning permitted, or eaten dry if it did not, or fried in pork fat if there was pork fat, which there sometimes was and sometimes was not. The roll call was held and the names were called, and the marks were made in the company book. The drill was conducted on the parade ground, the commands given and the movements performed, the line dressed and the rifles presented, and the company wheeled right and wheeled left and halted, and stood at attention and stood at ease. The mail came or did not come. The guard duty came around when it was his turn, 2 hours on and 4 hours off, walking the post in the dark and challenging anyone who approached, and being relieved when the corporal of the guard came around. The letter was written in the evening by firelight, describing the camp and the food and the weather and the men in the mess and what he hoped the spring would bring. And then the tattoo drum sounded and the fire was reduced and the blankets were arranged and the day was over. And the drum would sound again in the morning, and it always did. Good night. Part 16. The Clothing and Equipment. A Civil War soldier carried on his person and in his knapsack a quantity of equipment that had been specified by the regulations governing his army, and that was the material expression of everything he needed to function as a soldier in the field. The weight of this equipment, when fully assembled, was considerable, and the carrying of it on the march was one of the primary physical demands of military service. But in the camp the equipment was mostly stored, the knapsack sitting in the tent or the hut, and the daily engagement with the items it contained was the engagement of maintenance, cleaning, mending, checking for damage or wear. The uniform of the Union soldier was made of wool, which was the standard fabric for military clothing of the period for practical reasons. Wool provided warmth even when wet. It was durable, and it was available in sufficient quantity from American sources to clothe an army of the size the Union was assembling. The dark blue wool coat and the light blue wool trousers were the standard uniform, and they were worn every day throughout the year, in all weathers and all temperatures. The wool was hot in summer and warm in winter, and the soldier who wore it through a Virginia summer or a Tennessee summer did so with a discomfort that the letters of the period document extensively. The shoes of the Union soldier were called brogans, a sturdy, square-toed leather shoe that was issued in left and right pairs, which distinguished them from earlier army footwear that had been issued in identical pairs that were not specifically fitted to either foot. The brogans were not comfortable shoes by modern standards, being stiff and heavy and not shaped to the specific contours of the individual foot, but they were durable, and they kept the feet protected from the ground, which was what was required of them. The breaking in of a new pair of brogans was a process that soldiers described with some feeling, the initial stiffness of the leather producing blisters that were one of the universal experiences of the new soldier on his first significant march. The Confederate soldier's uniform was, in principle, a grey version of the Union uniform, the grey being the colour adopted by the Confederate Army as its standard. In practice, the Confederate uniform was considerably more variable than its Union counterpart, the South's manufacturing capacity being less extensive than the North's, and the blockade of Confederate ports reducing the availability of imported materials. Confederate soldiers wore what was available, which sometimes included grey wool of the regulation type, sometimes included butternut-coloured cloth that was a natural tan or brown colour produced from locally available dye materials, and sometimes included a mixture of Confederate-issued items and civilian clothing that had been brought from home or obtained by other means. The knapsack that the soldier carried on the march was a leather or canvas bag strapped to the back, containing his personal equipment. The regulations specified the contents of the knapsack in considerable detail, and the actual contents of any individual soldier's knapsack reflected both the regulations and the practical judgment of the soldier about what was genuinely necessary and what could be discarded to reduce the weight. The regulation contents included the soldier's spare clothing, his toilet articles, his eating utensils, his sewing kit, and various other items. The actual contents, after any significant march in which the weight of the knapsack had made itself felt, frequently included fewer items than the regulation specified, the surplus having been discarded along the road in the interest of reducing the load. The rifle was the soldier's most important piece of equipment, and was treated accordingly. The standard rifle of the Union infantry was the Springfield Model 1861, a muzzle-loading percussion rifle with a rifled barrel that gave it considerably more accuracy and effective range than the smoothbore muskets of earlier conflicts. The rifle was loaded by tearing open a paper cartridge that contained both the powder charge and the lead bullet, pouring the powder down the barrel, and then using the ramrod to push the bullet down onto the powder charge, after which a percussion cap was placed on the nipple at the breech, and the rifle was ready to fire. An experienced soldier could load and fire 2 or 3 rounds per minute using this procedure, which was the standard rate of fire for Civil War infantry. In the camp, the rifle was maintained by cleaning after any use and periodically when it had not been used but time had passed, the metal of the barrel and the lock being susceptible to rust if not attended to. The cleaning was done with the cleaning rod, a segmented metal rod that screwed together to reach the length of the barrel, and with patches of cloth soaked in oil that were run through the barrel on the rod to remove any fouling and leave a light coat of oil on the metal. The exterior metal surfaces were also oiled, and the wooden stock was sometimes treated with oil to keep the wood from drying and cracking. Part 17. The Fatigues and Labour. Beyond the drill and the guard duty and the inspections, the daily life of the Civil War soldier included a significant amount of what the army called fatigue duty, which was the labour required to keep the camp and the army's infrastructure functioning. Fatigue duty included wood cutting, water carrying, cooking for the company, cleaning and maintenance of the camp area, construction and repair of roads and fortifications, and a range of other physical tasks that the army needed done, and that were assigned to the soldiers on a rotating basis. The wood-cutting detail was among the most regular of the fatigue duties, particularly in winter quarters where the daily fuel requirements of the camp were substantial. The detail consisted of a group of soldiers taken from the day's roster, armed with axes, and sent under the supervision of a non-commissioned officer to the nearest available source of wood, which might be a quarter-mile from the camp, or several miles depending on how long the camp had been in place. The men cut the trees, trimmed the branches, and cut the trunks into sections of manageable length, which were then loaded onto wagons or carried by hand back to the camp and distributed for fuel. The water-carrying detail performed similar service for the Senate's water supply, the nearest reliable water source being not always immediately adjacent to the campsite. The carrying of water for a regiment of several hundred men was a substantial logistical task, and the water parties carrying buckets and canteens and any other vessels available made multiple trips each day between the water source and the camp. The quality of the water obtained was not always good, the nearest stream or pond being subject to contamination from the upstream activities of other units of the army or from the camp's own waste, and the soldiers who drank contaminated water paid for it in the ways already described. The construction of roads and fortifications was heavy labour that was assigned to infantry as fatigue duty when it was required, the army not having an unlimited supply of engineer troops for this purpose. The building of earthworks, which were the defensive fortifications that became a feature of the later stages of the war, required the digging of large quantities of earth and the moving of it to the correct positions, which was done with shovels and with the manual labour of the men. An infantry regiment ordered to dig a section of earthwork spent a day or more shovelling earth, a task that was physically demanding and that produced the kind of fatigue that was different in character from the fatigue of marching. Not the fatigue of sustained motion, but the fatigue of sustained exertion in a fixed position, the muscles of the arms and shoulders and back bearing the accumulated strain of hours of digging. The cooking detail for the company was another fatigue assignment, the men who drew this duty for a given period being responsible for preparing the company's rations rather than leaving it to each individual mess to manage its own food. In practice, the mess system meant that the cooking was usually managed at the mess level rather than the company level, but in some situations and some regiments, the company level cooking detail was the established method. The men assigned to it spent their day at the company's cooking fires. These fatigue duties occupied a significant portion of the hours that were not taken up by the formal military training activities, and they were a reminder that the army was not only a fighting force, but a large organization that needed to maintain itself in the field, and that the maintenance was done primarily by the labor of the men who made up the organization. Part 18. The sutler's goods in detail. The goods available at the sutler's tent or store deserved a more detailed accounting than they received earlier in this narrative, because they illuminate the specific material needs and desires of the men in camp, and the ways in which those needs were met or not met by the standard military supply. Among the most consistently available and consistently purchased items were canned goods, which were a relatively recent technological development that had become commercially important in the years before the Civil War, and that were genuinely useful in the conditions of military life. Canned condensed milk produced by Gale Borden's company using the condensing process he had developed in the 1850s was a particular staple of the sutler's inventory in Union camps. The condensed milk, sweetened with sugar, could be added to coffee to improve it considerably, or eaten on hardtack as a sweet preparation, and it was purchased by soldiers who could afford it in quantities that reflected its genuine value in a diet otherwise lacking in both dairy and sweetness. Canned oysters and canned vegetables were also available when the sutler had them in stock, which was not always. The canned oyster was a luxury item by the standards of camp provisioning, and was consumed with appreciation by men for whom fresh food of any kind was infrequently available. The canned vegetables, typically tomatoes or corn or peas, were purchased for the simple reason that the absence of vegetables from the standard ration was felt, over time, as a physical deficiency that manifested in the ways that vitamin and mineral deficiencies manifest. Cheese was sold by the sutler in the form of hard, aged cheeses that travelled and kept reasonably well. Butter, more perishable, was available when the sutler could obtain it and keep it from spoiling, which in warm weather was not always possible. Crackers other than hardtack were sometimes available. Crackers of a commercial production that were at least somewhat more palatable than the army's issue. The tobacco available at the sutlers was a primary commodity for the large proportion of the army that smoked. The pipe was the most common smoking instrument, and pipe tobacco of various grades was available from the sutler at prices that were consistently higher than the men considered fair. Cigars were available at a still higher price. The chewing tobacco that was another common form of tobacco consumption was also stocked. The man who smoked spent a significant portion of his monthly pay on tobacco, and the men who did not smoke sometimes sold or traded their tobacco ration, when one was issued, to those who did. Writing supplies were another important category of sutler's goods. Paper, envelopes, pencils, and ink were purchased by those who needed to write, but had exhausted their supply of the materials issued by the army. The price of paper and envelopes at the sutlers was a subject of complaint, the men who needed to write letters being in a situation similar to the men who needed tobacco, a captive market with a single supplier and no alternative. Part 19. The Sound of the Camp. The Civil War camp had a characteristic soundscape that was as specific to it as any other feature, and the soldiers who lived in it experienced it so constantly that they ceased to hear it as sounds, and heard it simply as the ambient quality of the place where they were. The way any habituated sound becomes part of the background of consciousness rather than an active object of attention. The drum was the primary instrument of the military day, its calls marking each transition of the daily schedule from the reveille of the morning to the tattoo of the evening. The drummer boy who played these calls was doing so on a field drum, a shallow drum slung at his side by a strap, beaten with two wooden sticks in the specific rhythmic patterns that were the language of the military day. The sound of the field drum carried clearly in the open air of the camp, its rhythm reaching every tent and every hut without ambiguity, the specific call identifying itself to the experienced ear as reliably as a word identifies itself to the reader. The bugle supplemented the drum in some calls, its clear, bright tone travelling even further than the drum in favourable conditions and cutting through other ambient sounds with the penetrating quality that made it useful for military communication. The bugle calls of the Civil War Army were a set of standardized signals that had been adopted from European military practice, and they were the same calls in both the Union and Confederate armies, since both had inherited the same military tradition. The sound of a bugle call in the morning, particularly the réveillé, was reported by many soldiers as one of the sounds most strongly associated with their memory of the war, the immediate and inescapable summons to the day, embedded in the memory more permanently than many events of greater importance. Beyond the formal musical instruments of the military day, the camp was filled with the sounds of a large community engaged in the activities of daily life. The sound of axes on wood as the fuel detail cut timber, the sound of hammer on metal from the direction of the blacksmith who maintained the horses' shoes and the army's iron equipment, the sound of horses and mules in the areas of the camp assigned to the animals, the murmur of conversation from nearby tents, the creak of wagon wheels as the supply wagons moved through the camp, the sound of a fiddle from somewhere in the company street, playing a tune that was recognizable or not depending on how skilled the player was. In the evening, the sound of the camp took on a different character, the activity reducing and the sounds that remained standing out more clearly against the quieter background. A song started in one tent might be taken up by others nearby, the familiar songs of the period spreading through the section of the camp where the acoustics allowed it to be heard, the sound of prayer from the chaplain's tent during an evening meeting, the sound of a sentinel calling out to someone approaching a post in the dark. These sounds, familiar and constant, constituted the acoustic environment of the Civil War camp, as specific to that environment as the sounds of any other place, and as thoroughly absorbed into the background of consciousness of the men who lived there that they noticed them only when they stopped, or when they were away from the camp and the silence felt wrong. Part 20. the long wait. The fundamental experience of the Civil War soldier in camp was the experience of waiting. Waiting for orders to march, waiting for the war to do something, waiting for the mail, waiting for the paymaster, waiting for the rations to be distributed, waiting for the detail to be called, waiting for the guard rotation, waiting for the tattoo drum and the end of the day, waiting for the spring in winter, waiting for the thing that would end the waiting. The Civil War was a long war. It lasted 4 years, which was longer than anyone on either side had anticipated when it began, and the men who fought it spent those 4 years largely in the camps, in the long intervals between the engagements that the military histories recount, and that were, in terms of the total time, a small fraction of the whole. The waiting was the majority. The waiting was the war, for most of the men, for most of the time. The men who managed the waiting well were the men who found things to do within the constraints of the camp, who established routines and maintained them, who engaged with their messmates and their letters and their cards and their music and their religion, and who found in the ordinary texture of the camp day-sufficient substance to fill the hours and to sustain the sense of purpose and identity that the camp structure provided. The men who managed it less well were those for whom the days blurred together without any distinguishing quality, the weeks and months passing in a grey uniformity that wore on the spirit in the way that sustained monotony always wears on the spirit. The letters home of the Civil War soldier contained, across all their variety of specific content, this same underlying message: I am still here. The day was like the day before. I am well or not well. I ate what was provided. I drilled and stood roll call and wrote this letter. The mail from home is what I wait for. The end of the war is what I wait for after that. I am still here. This message, repeated in millions of letters from hundreds of thousands of men, is the primary document of the Civil War camp experience, and it is a document not of drama but of duration. The drama was in the battles, and the battles were a small part of the whole, and the whole was this: the camp, the drum, the coffee, the hardtack, the drill, the mail, the guard duty, the tattoo, the sleep, and the drum again in the morning, day after day, season after season, for the length of the war, which was 4 years, which was a long time to wait, but they waited. And in the evenings they wrote about it, by firelight, in the small, careful handwriting of men writing to the people they missed, describing the ordinary details of the ordinary days, one after another, in the long and quiet accounting of what their lives had become, and what they hoped their lives would return to when the waiting was over. The fire burned low, the letter was folded and addressed, the tattoo drum sounded, the day was done. This has been life in camps during the Civil War. The morning drums sounded before the light. The boots were put on and the roll call was held in the cold air of the company street. The sergeant calling the names and the men answering. The fire was small and the coffee was strong and the hardtack was hard, as it was every morning, and as it would be every morning for as many mornings as the camp remained in this place. The drill was conducted on the parade ground, the company wheeling and halting and presenting arms in the grey winter light, the commands sounding in the still air. The mail came, and some men received letters and some did not, and the ones who did not went back to their tents and waited for the next mail day. The guard duty came when it came, 2 hours on and 4 hours off. the night cold and long and quiet except for the sounds of the camp settling around the small fires. The letter was written by candlelight, describing the weather and the food and the distance still to go before it was over, and the candle was blown out, and the blanket was arranged, and the camp was quiet, and the morning would come again before the light, and the drum would sound, and it always sounded, and the day would begin again as the day had always begun, in the camp, in the cold, with the coffee and the hardtack and the drill and the long, ordinary, patient, quiet hours of waiting that were the true texture of the soldier's life. Not the battles that history remembered, but the days between, which were most of the days, which were almost all of the days, which were the war, as most of the men who fought it actually experienced it, from the first drum to the last, in the camps of the American Civil War. Good night. End. Part 21. The Horses and Mules. The Civil War army moved and supplied itself through the labour of horses and mules, which were present in the camp in large numbers, and which required daily care that was performed by soldiers assigned to that duty. The horses served as mounts for the cavalry, the officers, and the artillery, and as draft animals for the artillery pieces and the supply wagons. The mules served primarily as draft animals for the wagon trains that supplied the army with its food, ammunition, and equipment. The care of the horses and mules in the camp was the responsibility of the cavalry troopers and the teamsters who drove the wagons, supplemented by the infantry soldiers assigned to fatigue duty in the animal areas. The daily care routine for a horse included feeding, watering, grooming, and the inspection of the animal's feet and legs for any signs of injury or disease. The grooming of a horse using the curry comb and the brush in the prescribed sequence removed the dirt and loose hair from the coat and stimulated the circulation of the skin, and it was one of the tasks of the morning that was considered both practically necessary and in some way beneficial to the relationship between the soldier and the animal. The feet of the horses required particular attention, as the condition of a horse's feet was fundamental to its ability to work. The blacksmith of the regiment, or the farrier, was responsible for the shoeing of the horses, which was done at regular intervals as the shoes wore down and needed to be replaced, and also as needed when a shoe was lost or a foot required attention. The process of shoeing a horse was a skilled craft, involving the preparation of the foot by trimming and cleaning, the fitting of the iron shoe to the specific shape of the individual foot, and the nailing of the shoe in place with the characteristic angled nails that bent outward at the hoof wall and were then clinched to secure the shoe firmly. The mules of the wagon train were somewhat less demanding in their care than the cavalry horses, being hardier animals with more resistant feet, and constitutions better adapted to the conditions of field service. The mule's reputation for stubbornness was reflected in the letters of the soldiers who dealt with them, the particular intransigence of an unwilling mule being described with a vividness that suggests the encounters were memorable. A mule that had decided not to move was a significant practical problem in a situation where everything depended on the movement of the supply wagons, and the methods used to persuade an unwilling mule to cooperate were varied and sometimes creative. The feeding of the horses and mules required a continuous supply of hay and grain that was part of the army's overall logistical burden, the animals requiring their daily rations regardless of what else the army was doing or how stretched the supply lines were. A horse in hard work needed perhaps 10 to 14 pounds of hay and 8 to 10 pounds of grain per day, and a mule somewhat less. But the numbers multiplied across the many hundreds of animals in a large army's train produced a supply requirement that was enormous, and that was a constant preoccupation of the army's quartermaster officers. Part 22. The Paymaster. The Paymaster was the officer responsible for distributing the monthly pay to the soldiers of his assigned regiments, and his arrival in the camp was an event that was anticipated with the same enthusiasm as the mail and more practical urgency, since the pay was the means by which the soldiers met their debts to the sutler and by which they sent money home to their families. The actual arrival of the Paymaster was not always on schedule. The documentary record of the Civil War is full of references to delays in the payment of the troops, delays that stretched from days to weeks to sometimes months, particularly in the Confederate Army, where financial difficulties produced chronic problems with regular payment. A soldier who was owed 3 months back pay and whose debts to the sutler had been accumulating during that period was in a situation that many Civil War soldiers described in their letters with varying degrees of urgency and complaint. When the Paymaster did arrive, the process of payment was conducted in a formal and methodical manner. The soldiers of each company were assembled in order and called forward by name, each man signing or marking the payroll to acknowledge receipt of the amount due him, and the Paymaster or his assistant counting out the coins or bills into the man's hand. The money was in United States greenbacks in the Union Army, which were the paper currency issued by the federal government, and which had a variable value relative to gold during the war, depending on the military situation and the financial confidence of the market. The immediate aftermath of a payday in the camp was a period of elevated commercial activity, the sutler's store being busy with soldiers settling their accounts and making new purchases, and the card games in the tents becoming larger and involving more money than the penny stakes games of the payless weeks. Some soldiers sent money home immediately, addressing an envelope with the appropriate amount and trusting it to the mail, and the letters accompanying these remittances contained the same mixture of practical accounting and emotional communication that characterized all the letters of the war. Part 23. The Weather and the Mud. The weather was a constant presence in the life of the Civil War camp, shaping the conditions of every day and the feasibility of every activity in ways that the modern reader, insulated from weather by central heating and waterproof clothing and sealed buildings, may find difficult to fully appreciate. The soldier in his canvas tent was not insulated from the weather in any significant way. When it rained, the rain was present in the tent in the form of the sound of it on the canvas, and the smell of wet canvas and wet wool, and the water that came through the seams when the rain was heavy enough, and the mud that formed on the floor of the tent from the water that came under the sides. The mud of a Civil War camp in wet weather was a specific and well-documented phenomenon. The combination of the bare earth of the camp's paths and the parade ground, and the areas around the tents with the rain that turned that earth into the particular glutinous mud of a place where many feet have been walking. This mud clung to the boots, and was carried into the tent and accumulated on the floor, and it was tracked along the company street and into every area of the camp where the men walked, which was every area of the camp. the Burnside Mud March of January 1863, when the Army of the Potomac attempted to move in winter conditions and was stopped by mud that was deeper and more adhesive than any tactical obstacle an enemy could have placed in its way, was an extreme example of a condition that was present in a milder form throughout the wet seasons of the war in the Eastern Theatre. The letters of the soldiers describing winter mud in the Virginia camps were consistent in their characterization. It was not ordinary mud, but something that had the consistency of thick paste, and the depth of several inches, and the adhesive quality of something specifically designed to prevent movement. The management of mud in the camp was addressed by various means, none of them fully effective. Boards laid on the paths between the tents created a walkway above the mud level, though the boards themselves sank into the mud over time and needed to be replaced or supplemented. Gravel or sand, when available, was spread on the most travelled paths to improve the surface. In winter quarters, where the expectation of an extended stay justified more substantial improvements, some camps had covered walkways and graded paths that managed the mud with more success than the improvised solutions of the temporary camp. The cold that accompanied the rain in the autumn and winter months added another dimension to the discomfort of wet weather in camp. Wool clothing that had become wet was heavier than dry wool and slower to dry, and the drying of wet clothing and equipment in the confined space of the tent was a challenge that required positioning items near enough to the small fire or brazier to dry without being so near as to present a fire hazard. The fire itself, when there was a fire in the tent, produced warmth that was welcome, but also smoke that was irritating, the ventilation of a closed tent in cold weather being necessarily limited. Part 24. The Photographs. A small number of Civil War soldiers were photographed during their service in the portrait studios that appeared near some of the larger camps, offering the new technology of photography as a service to soldiers who wanted to send an image home to their families. The photographs of the Civil War, which survive in large numbers in archives and collections, are among the most direct visual evidence of what the men of the war looked like and how they presented themselves. The photographs were almost always formal portraits, the subject sitting or standing in front of a plain backdrop, in full uniform, in the position best calculated to present a respectable and military appearance. The long exposure times required by the photography of the period meant that movement produced blur, which meant that subjects needed to hold still for several seconds, and the headrests and supports sometimes used to help subjects maintain their position during the exposure contributed to the stiff, formal quality of many Civil War portraits. A soldier who went to have his photograph taken for sending home was making a deliberate presentation of himself as a soldier in his uniform, with his equipment arranged to show it to advantage. He was saying, by the photograph, that he was well enough to sit for a portrait, that he was dressed in the uniform of his army, that he was a soldier. The family who received the photograph had a representation of what the man looked like in his military identity, which was different from the man they had known in civilian life, and which was the man they would not see in person for however long the war continued. The ambrotype and the tintype were the photographic formats most commonly used for these camp portraits, both being more affordable and more portable than the earlier daguerreotype. The tintype in particular was cheap enough to be accessible to ordinary soldiers and durable enough to be carried in a pocket without damage, and they were produced in very large numbers during the war years. A tintype of a soldier might be set in a small paper folder that could be mailed home or carried in the soldier's own pocket as a personal item. Part 25. The return to quiet as the war moved toward its conclusion. The character of the camps changed in ways that reflected the changed character of the war itself. The camps of the final months were in some cases camps of an army that knew the end was approaching, the mood of the men reflecting the accumulated knowledge of 4 years of war and the growing sense that the resolution was within sight, even if it was not yet arrived. The final camps were struck, as all camps were struck, in the morning, with the same procedures that had governed the striking of every camp before them. The tents came down, the equipment was packed, the men formed up in column and began to march. And when the marching ended and the war ended, the men did not immediately go home. They remained in camps for some further period, the mustering out of an army of several 100,000 men being a process that took weeks and months, and the camps of the mustering out period were the last camps. The final daily routine of reveille and roll call and drill and mail and guard duty and tattoo and sleep. When the men were finally discharged and began to make their way home by rail and by boat and on foot, the camp was behind them in a way it had not been before. It had always been behind them before, in the sense that the next camp was always ahead, and the current camp was temporary, and the whole existence was temporary and would end when the war ended. Now the war had ended and the camp was behind them, and the morning drum was not going to sound tomorrow. The drum did not sound. The morning came without it, as mornings do, and the men who had been hearing it for 2 or 3 or 4 years heard its absence in the way that any habituated sound is heard in its absence, as a kind of presence that is the shape of the thing that is no longer there. Then the morning continued, and the day continued, and the life that had been interrupted by the war and by the camps continued also, with all the sounds of civilian life replacing the sounds of the camp, and the coffee was still made in the morning because coffee did not stop being important, because the war had ended, and the letter was still sometimes written in the evening, though it was now a different letter to a different situation. And the camp was over, and the drum was silent, and the men who had lived in it went home, and the ground where the camp had been returned to whatever it had been before. A field, a hillside, a patch of ground in Virginia or Tennessee or Maryland, where the grass grew back over the packed earth of the company street and the parade ground and the places where the fires had been, and in a year or two it was not possible to tell from looking at the ground that anything had been there at all, except that it had been there. The camp had been there, with all its drums and its coffee and its hardtack and its mail and its guard duty and its card games and its fiddle music and its letters. It had been there for as long as it was needed, and it had done what it was needed to do, which was to provide the place where the men lived between the battles, in the long, ordinary days that were most of the days, in the long, quiet patience of the camp, which was where the war, for most of the men, most of the time, actually was. In the camp, in the morning drum, in the coffee, in the long and ordinary days. Good night. End. A final note on the sources. The account given in this story of life in the Civil War camps is drawn primarily from the letters and diaries written by the soldiers themselves, which constitute an extraordinary archive of personal testimony about a historical experience. These documents were written by men who had no expectation that their letters would be read by anyone other than the person they were addressed to, and they have therefore a quality of directness and specificity that more formal historical sources do not always possess. The letter of a soldier describing his morning coffee is a document of the morning coffee. It is not embellished, and it is not abstracted. It is the thing itself, set down in words by the person who experienced it, on the day or close to the day that it happened, with all the ordinary detail of a real experience recorded by a person who had no reason to make it more interesting than it was. It was as interesting as it was, which was how interesting the morning coffee was, which was not very interesting, but which was real. The realness of these letters is what makes them valuable, and what makes the history they record different in character from the history that appears in the accounts of the generals and the politicians who also wrote about the war. The soldiers who wrote from the camps about the camps, and the camps were where they were, and the camps were what they knew, and the account of the camp in their letters is therefore the account of the war as they lived it, which was not the account of the generals, but was also the war, and was in fact the larger part of it. The drum sounded before sunrise, the roll call was held, the coffee was made, the hardtack was eaten, the drill was conducted, the mail came or did not come, the guard duty came when it came, the letter was written by the small light of the candle, and then the tattoo drum sounded, and the day was done. As it was every day, for the length of the war, which was a very long time in a tent or in a hut far from home waiting. Sleep well. The ground where the camp had been was just ground again. The grass grew back over the company streets and the parade ground and the places where the fires had been built and the places where the tents had stood. The packed earth softened in the rain, and the grass seeds found it, and the grass returned. And in a season or two it was impossible to tell that anything had been there at all, unless you knew what to look for, and most people did not know what to look for. And so they walked across ground that had been a camp and did not know it, and the camp was over, as camps always eventually are, and the morning drum was silent, and the day began without it, as days do. The fire that had burned in the hut through the winter was ash now, cold ash in a clay fireplace that nobody would tend again, and the wind came through the door and moved the ash slightly, and then the wind stopped, and the ash was still, and the camp was silent, and the war was over, and the men were home, and that was the end of it.